G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video, we are going through my final thoughts ahead of the Australian Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. This is going to be a very quick one, digesting everything after FP2 on Friday afternoon out at Albert Park. So we'll go through my key deadline considerations, top tips for this race weekend, and revisit my final thoughts. But before we do that, I did want to just say I've recently been brought on by F1 to cover F1 fantasy this season. There was an article published less than 12 hours ago on my optimal team for this weekend, or at least drivers and constructors you should consider if not going straight into your team, those that I think should be on your radar. I'll link the article in the description below if you'd like to take a look if you haven't done so before. But in terms of my considerations for this weekend, we'll go through a few teams. First cab off the rank is McLaren, and after FP2, to me, they looked like the best team in the bunch. I was really impressed that Oscar and Lando were able to continue to build on that good form from Bahrain. They were top of the timing charts, or very close to that, throughout both free practice sessions. On Friday afternoon, I'm going to bring the free practice times up on the screen here. You can see in FP1, Lando Norris, P1, Oscar Piastri, P4, and rivaled by Charles Leclerc in P3. Lewis Hamilton a little further down in P1, but I always find that P1's probably the session that gives us the least amount of data, so I wouldn't read into that too much. Carlos Sainz really interested to see. We'll talk about Williams in just a second, but McLaren certainly set the tone early on and then continued to back that up. We'll go over to FP2 now, where Piastri and Norris were second and third respectively. So again, it looks like Piastri, Leclerc, and Norris in that order seem to be the top three for this weekend. That's kind of my initial read of it. Hamilton on the fringes, Max Verstappen a little bit further down. So I think all the omens are pointing to McLaren this weekend as probably the team to beat, to be honest. Now, a big surprise that came out of FP1 specifically was Williams. I've got here the race DNFs last year was the worst in Formula One, but it looks as though with this new driver pairing, that will not be the case. I think after what we saw from Carlos Sainz and Alex Albon in FP1, Sainz, as I pointed out before, running second on the order, Albon a little further down in sixth. Again, keep in mind, this is all single lap pace, but I think a good sign nonetheless, given we saw some quickness out of those two drivers in Bahrain. FP2, a little bit further in 11th and 12th respectively, but I think if we see anything similar to what we saw in free practice one, then I do think Williams constructor and Carlos Sainz could be great options heading into the deadline. So keep an eye on Williams tomorrow to see whether or not that pace translates into anything worth monitoring for our teams. Quickly on Red Bull, Max and Lawson just didn't look like they were with it. Liam Lawson in particular was very much off the pace. He was outside the top 10 for pretty much both sessions on Friday. And the only reason I'd very much even consider Red Bull is simply because Max is extremely good in the wet. The pit stop points for me, again, I'm not going to try and let it dictate too much of my thought process. I think there is some stock in there. But the only real situation I see Red Bull coming home with a haul of points is if both drivers qualify outside the top 10. The wet race suddenly becomes a bit of a crapshoot for who's scoring points, overtakes positions gained, and Liam and Max suddenly shoot up the order through, a different tyre strategy or something like that. So I do think Red Bull, probably not for me at the moment. And then quickly on Haas, look, I don't think much can be said right now that's suddenly going to make them an absolute must-buy in anyone's team. Now, I think their price point is still value for money, and I wouldn't necessarily say just because they were running dead last through both practice sessions on Friday and Behrman crashed as well, that it suddenly makes them a no-go. I think there's a situation where just because of their price, they become a good enabler, but I just don't see them making as many overtakes if they're running so far down the order. And again, I will say take the timing charts with a grain of salt. But if we go all the way down to what was in, this is FP2, I think. So Behrman obviously didn't run in that session. Esteban Ocon was 1/10 back from Bortoleto in a Sauber and 3/10 back from Lawson in a Red Bull. So definitely not a good sign there. And then in FP1, separating these two drivers by 2/10, and that was half a second behind a Sauber. So I'm very much reluctant to double up on both of these guys right now. I could see a world in which I maybe have one, but certainly not both, unless, of course, I suddenly feel confident from what we see in FP3 tomorrow. So that's kind of where my initial thoughts are for the deadline today. In terms of the next slide, I've got my asset tier ranking, which was quite a hit last season. This has been graded on free practice times today. In my opinion, very subjective. I admit you may choose to swap some of the drivers out, and I think Oscar Piastri in particular, I put him as first simply just because of his price over Lando Norris. I think Lando in a vacuum, Charles in a vacuum, much better drivers fantasy-wise than Oscar Piastri on balance, but I do think just simply Oscar's value provides a bit more flexibility with certain teams and combinations. Now, George Russell I have fourth, and I think that's maybe a little unfair on him, simply because he is an excellent qualifier. We saw in the second half of the year, he became a very good fantasy asset to own. I'm just going to pull something up from one of my favorite statistical pages to follow on Twitter, F1 guy Dan. Dan has condensed all of the long runs from FP2 this afternoon, and George Russell comes out second on average on the hard compound too. I think that's really quite impressive, given that's not what I really expected from a driver like George in a team like Mercedes, but I think that opens the door for a Mercedes-McLaren combination in terms of our team builds. And I really do think doubling up, going through the McLaren constructor, is another alternative to going down that coverage as opposed to simply just Oscar Piastri, if he was one such driver you wanted to consider for your 2X. Again, Red Bull, as I said, a little off the pace here, and Ferrari quite competitive. You can see Charles Leclerc up in third, but I think McLaren's still the team to beat, just simply because Lando and Oscar are first and fourth, which, as I said, may be why I choose to go the Russell-McLaren route instead of the Piastri-Ferrari and Mercedes one. So that is kind of where my head is at for the top tiers and teams. In the midfield, again, I think you can move these drivers around a little bit, but I like Bortoleto simply because he looked comfortable enough in the car this afternoon. Sainz in that Williams, I moved him up. I had him about fifth or so, fourth or fifth. But I think if that Williams looks particularly competitive, he becomes a very viable option. But simply at his price, will be difficult to squeeze in. Ocon, again, I think just his experience alone is why I like him over, say, the likes of a Gasly or an Alonso. And then a bit further down, we're getting into kind of a situation where between the 5th and the 10th drivers, you could certainly pivot. Antonelli I've got there, again, because of more of a budget building option than actually a driver I see matching his points per million. But again, happy to be proven wrong, and I think the rain will throw a few spanner in the works where that could really swing either way. And I got Williams at the top for my constructors, and then I think after that it's interchangeable, to say the least. So final team thoughts for this week. I still think I'm leaning towards a Piastri, Ferrari, Mercedes build as it stands. I've got George Russell and Lando Norris if I went down the McLaren and Williams route for the latter. But right now, very much liking the look of Oscar Piastri at that 2X. He's a good driver. I've spoken a lot about him in my team selection videos. And I think fills me with a lot of confidence at home this weekend. No chips for me this week. I don't think it's a chip weekend. We may see some flying next week, but we will talk about that when we get to it. And as I'm sure, as you all know, rain is expected on the Sunday. Hot conditions forecast tomorrow on Saturday. So I think that will very much affect the running order in the top teams, how they qualify, whether or not that opens up some positions gained on the Sunday for overtakes and such. And speaking of Saturday qualifying, that is when the first deadline of the season is. So make sure you lock in your teams ahead of qualifying once we've got all 3 free practice sessions fully digested and considered for our F1 fantasy analysis. So I'm going to bring back my team onto the screen here. Talked about this again in my team selection, so I won't go into it in great detail again this time around. But as you can see here, I've got one slot open, which was previously occupied by Isaac Hadjar. Now, that 1 million spare I wanted to leave to give me some flexibility in China. I've thought about, I still may well consider going down that path, but I could potentially also fill it with Jack Doohan. The other approach I'm very much considering is removing Ollie Behrman in favor of the French driver at RB. I think just because of how Haas looked, not just in practice, but I think over the course of testing, where I thought they might be cooking something up, but it looks like they've given us food poisoning instead of a really nicely put together tyre strategy. I think for that reason, I'm much less inclined to go down a double Haas driver pairing and keep, 0.5 spare. I think that's perfectly fine. I like Doohan. I think the Alpine looks pretty competitive. He finished ahead of Pierre Gasly in both practice sessions as well. So I think that is something he can take with a lot of confidence. So the other team I was talking about just before was the George Russell McLaren pairing. And again, I'd have to do a little bit of pivoting here. The George Russell McLaren, that would give me 6.9 to probably bring in. I'd like Hülkenberg for the reliability, to be honest, over someone like going for Ollie Behrman. So this is another approach I'm very much considering. 3 rookies, but all of them I was quite impressed with in practice today. And I think McLaren constructor, as I said, would cover off on Lando Norris's production. George Russell, if we again go back over to the statistics Dan had laid out, you can see George on the hard, his long run pace looked really good, ahead of drivers I would expect to be ahead of him simply because of the car that they are in. So I think that bodes quite well for George. As we know, a really good qualifier. But if they do struggle in the heat tomorrow, there's every possibility they could unlock additional performance on Sunday where it is cooler temperatures. So if George qualifies, 6th, 7th, I'd fully expect him to charge back to around 4th, maybe even a podium finish if things go his way. So they're probably the 2 main approaches I'm thinking of right at this minute. The only other world in which I wouldn't go down a path of the previous 2 builds would be if, for whatever reason, Sainz and Albon were at the top of the timing charts in FP3 and their simulation data looked like a top 3 or top 4 team compared to what we've probably been accustomed to the last couple of seasons. So in that eventuality, probably not something I'd be absolutely jumping at, but that would probably mean I bring in Oscar Piastri and Carlos Sainz. That would give me 1.4 to play with. In that situation, would I have enough to stretch Doohan up to, I'd say, Lance Stroll? Now, I know that sounds a little bit controversial, but I am going to bring the timing charts just back up on the screen here for a minute to go through. Stroll was not doing anything too crazy. He was 10th in free practice 1, and I think he was kind of there or thereabouts in free practice 2, 9th. So I'd feel pretty comfortable having Stroll in my team. And I know he is one of the more inconsistent drivers, but he is a driver that has a pretty good record of finishing races in Australia. And he has, more confidence than I would say on the wet tyre than he actually does on the dry. So, maybe Brazil last year is not a great example of that. But if you go further back, I've seen many situations where Lance Stroll has looked comfortable in wet weather. So for that reason, I think he could certainly become a viable option for this kind of lineup if I choose to go down that, should Williams look pretty good. But I think, all in all, going back to the team calculator, I took Ollie Behrman out for one of these equations because I wanted to not go down the double Haas route. Oh, that's Ocon. What if I went no Behrman and put Ocon in instead? That would kind of spit out a similar lineup to what I had on the screen before. I think the thing is, we've talked about price changes. I'm not going to go into detail in this video, something to talk about next week, but there is a possibility most teams may see a minor drop in value in the first race of the season based on how the pricing model is currently structured. And I think it's probably something we just have to bite and kind of deal with. Another positive to go down the Williams route is that there is a much smaller drop simply on the back of owning a B tier constructor. So the expected price decrease is, 0.2 if you went down a Williams or an Alpine route compared to, say, a Ferrari and Mercedes combination. But that's kind of not quite enough to convince me to go away from this Ferrari and Mercedes build that I've been leaning on for most of this week. So we'll play it by ear in FP3 tomorrow, but that's kind of where my head is at for final thoughts this week. So as always, guys, I'll be back tomorrow, first deadline stream of the season. Very excited. I'll be there 2 hours before the deadline, a very special, longer than usual edition for you guys to ask all of your questions live on stream. I'll get to every single one of them, I promise. We'll digest everything from FP3, go through the F1 Fantasy Tools simulations, and hopefully cobble together an optimal team for the first race week end of the season. So if you enjoyed what you see, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. And if you have any comments or questions about your final lineup dilemmas, let me know down in the comments below. But in the meantime, hope you have a great day, and I will see you all very soon.